So, yesterday, Vladimir Putin signed a decree in Russia basically saying that Russia would no longer sell vital raw materials to countries that it considered unfriendly. Okay, and those unfriendly countries, of course, include most of the nations of the West. Now, this is a complete disaster for the European Union and for Germany in particular, but also the other nations of Europe. This is basically signing a death warrant for the European economies. They will not survive this. A year from now, the standard of living of the European economies will be substantially lower than it is today. If you are a European citizen, because of this decree that Vladimir Putin signed, your standard of living, well, let's put it this way. If you're middle class, it's likely that you're going to be poor a year from today. I mean, like poor, and probably unemployed. And I'm not kidding around. Because you see, the Europeans committed financial suicide by sanctioning Russia. They sanctioned Russia and imposed this total economic warfare on Russia, thinking for some foolish reason that Russia's economy would collapse because of the European sanctions. They thought that Russia was, like Iran, only with nuclear weapons. But you see, Iran is a great nation, but it is not such a big nation that it is really autonomous, autarkic, in the sense of being able to supply itself with all of its needs. But Russia is. Russia, in fact, is probably the only nation on the face of the planet that truly is autarkic, in the sense of being able to supply its own raw materials, its own energy commodities, and its own industrial and consumer goods. They can do that. Certainly, Western goods in many aspects are better than Russian goods, but the Russians can get by. They can get by without Apple iPhones and without BMW cars. But Europe cannot get by without wheat, without aluminum, without neon, without gas, without oil from Russia. They need Russia. They need Russia more than Russia needs them. And you see, when the Europeans at the start of this conflict imposed all these sanctions on Russia, the Russians did not respond immediately because it's simply not the Russians' style. They take their sweet time with their reactions. Bismarck had a great saying that the Russians were slow to harness but quick to ride. And that pretty much sums them up. They take their sweet time, but once they've made up their minds, once they've taken a course of action, decided on a course of action, they stick with it. And they're not going to deviate from it. This decree that Vladimir Putin signed yesterday means that European industry will not have the raw materials to continue. European food processors will not have the raw materials, the wheat, the barley, the grains, to feed the European people. The European people are going to go hungry, and they're going to go cold, and they're going to go without their consumer goods and products and services. The European economy, because of this decree, is going to crash. The euro is going to collapse in value. It's inevitable. And you have to ask yourself, why was this done? Why did the Europeans impose all of these sanctions? Why did the Europeans do something so incredibly reckless as to steal Russia's sovereign funds? Because Russia had on deposit with the European institutions, financial institutions, they had their sovereign wealth fund, their monies, their exceedance. Because you see, all that money that they had on deposit in Europe was the money they had received for selling their commodities to Europe. That's where the money comes from, okay? And so what the Europeans did by, quote unquote, confiscating these monies, they basically stole Russian money. They basically took Russian commodities and refused to pay for them. And the Russians imposed the strategy of the two-track strategy of, deposit your euros with Gazprom Bank and you'll get rubles, and with those rubles you can buy gas from Gazprom, right? And the Europeans had a whole hissy fit, but a lot of European companies were going along with this because they need the gas, right? But now with this decree, this is the real decision that the Russians have made. The two-track policy of doing, deposit euros and get rubles and use the rubles to buy commodities from Russian companies, which was going to be expanded clearly. It's going to be expanded to not just from Gazprom Bank, it's going to be to Rosneft, which is the oil company, and it's also going to be applied to agricultural commodities, metals, gases, and all the rest of it. And so this is going to be the future insofar as trade with Russia is concerned, because they no longer trust the Europeans, because the Europeans went and stole $285 billion of their money. And they want it back, sure, number one. But number two, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So they're not going to put themselves in a position to be fooled again. And so they implemented this track, and some of the friendly countries, like Hungary, like Serbia and whatnot, they are going to be able to access Russian commodities. But countries like Germany, like France, like Poland, like the UK, like Italy, like Spain, they're not going to get it. They're all going to go poor. If you're in Europe now, if I were you, I'd figure out a way to get the hell out of the European continent, because you are going to suffer hunger and you are going to go cold next winter. And there are going to be rolling blackouts in Europe where there isn't going to be enough electricity 24/7. Yeah, that's coming. And you have no one to blame but your own governments because of their hysterical Russophobia and their inability to see the consequences of their action, their desire to virtue signal and to, I stand with Ukraine. That nonsense is going to hurt you. And it's going to hurt you in a way that you have never experienced. Your parents never experienced it. The only people who might have experienced something like this are your grandparents back in the Second World War. Because Europe is about to face an economic collapse that can only be comparable to the Second World War. And it's because of your own governments. Know whom to blame. The Russians are only reacting to what the Europeans did to them. The Europeans wanted to break the Russian economy, and they failed. They gave it their best shot with all of the sanctions, and they failed to break the Russian economy. Now it's the Russians' turn. And the Russians aim to break the European economy, and guess what? They actually have the means to do it. And so they are doing it.